Picking a proper perspective is a perilous preoccupation of many people penning a potential... What's another word for manuscript that starts with P? No decision that you make will have a larger impact on the feel and structure of your story than the perspective that it is written in. Well, I suppose the font also has a big impact, but perspective is way up there too. There's a strong argument that you can make any story work with any perspective, but I would also argue certain perspectives are definitely better for different types of stories. You need to consider a lot when deciding whether to write in first, second, or third person perspective, and this video should help you make that decision. But first, a reminder to take a second to subscribe to my channel. It will be the third best decision you make today, at least from my perspective. All right, let's get right into it, starting with the first-person perspective. First person is told directly from the perspective of the viewpoint character using I, we, and my, etc. It's as if the character is directly writing down the story or otherwise telling it to the reader. First-person perspective automatically yields a very close narrative distance and colors the writing very strongly in the character's voice. The closeness and voiciness are some of the main advantages of first-person perspective. No other perspective is as strongly influenced by the viewpoint character as first-person perspective is. And if your story is very much centered around one character, then first-person perspective is almost a no-brainer. Well, the character can have a brain, but you know what I mean. That being said, first-person perspective brings with it some difficulties. Sentence structure can be harder to manage in first-person perspective. In third-person perspective, you can use the character's name, a pronoun, or another noun to identify the character. You can use Fred, he, or the longshoreman from Minnesota to start a sentence if the story is written in third-person perspective. In first-person, you are limited largely to I, which can make sentences more repetitive and make it harder to vary the structure. Because first-person is inherently from the perspective of one character, you also need that character present in every scene in the novel. If there's a pivotal scene that it doesn't make sense for them to be in, then you're either forced to just show the effects of that scene or have the character learn about it in some way, which can be tricky. Now, you can get around this by having multiple first-person perspectives, like every chapter can be written from the perspective of different characters. I've never really seen this done well, and if you're going to go to that length, you should really ask yourself why the story just isn't written in third limited. First person is great if you've got a character-driven story that you want to be told as close to the character as possible. No other perspective puts the character first like first-person perspective does. I wonder if that's why it's called first. If your main character is the major draw of your story, first person will work extremely well to highlight that fact. However, if you've got a bigger cast or a more plot-driven narrative with lots of different subplots and things going on at the same time, then another perspective might be a better choice. Next up is second person perspective. You probably already know about this one. Second person perspective uses you as the main pronoun and basically tells the reader that the events of the story are happening to them. You turn the doorknob, you walk into the room, you sit down at the table, you eat an entire large meat lover's pizza. You run to the bathroom. Second person is by far the most immersive, experiential perspective out there. It's like the story is happening right at you. Aside from choose your own adventure books, second person is not widely used in mainstream storytelling. There are significantly more first and third person perspective stories out there. It can kind of work if you're doing something with amnesia or brainwashing where a character is being told what they did through time or something like that. But other than that, it doesn't have a lot of natural uses in a story. Second person is billed as the best way to create immersive, visceral stories that evoke strong feelings in the reader. But honestly, I could see the argument that a well-written third or first-person perspective could achieve the same thing without the inherent weirdness that second person brings. Another thing to consider here is that a lot of the disadvantages of first-person perspective are present in second person as well. For example, it's very hard to vary second-person perspective prose, and switching characters becomes even harder than in first-person perspective. An entire novel in second-person perspective would get old pretty fast. Most novels that I've encountered that use second person do so in short sections or individual scenes. Unless you have a compelling reason to use second-person perspective, I would say avoid it. Second-person perspective is one of those things that will become a main feature of your story and will drown out all of the other elements. If you're going to use it, you have to ask yourself, am I okay with this story largely being about the fact that it is second-person perspective? This is what happens when you use unusual techniques like this. They tend to suck all the oxygen out of the room, and everything else that you've worked hard on to add into your story will potentially be missed. And lastly, third-person perspective. I think if the literary world had to nominate a most useful perspective, then third-person perspective would come in first. It's like the SUV of perspectives. Rugged, versatile, you can fit a ton of people into it. It's a hazard to pedestrians, and people go into 3 decades worth of debt to buy one. Third person is told from a narrator's perspective using character names and pronouns. It's usually divided into either third limited perspective and third omniscient perspective. In third limited, our viewpoint is limited to one character at a time, whereas third omniscient allows for multiple simultaneous viewpoints. One thing that third-person perspective creates is the ability to have different narrative distances. We can have a very close perspective where we see inside a character's thoughts and emotions, or we can be quite far away and only observing their actions and external behaviors. A very far narrative distance is almost like a camera watching the events of the story. We can hear and see what people are doing, but we don't know their names, we don't know what they're thinking, we don't know their backstories. We're just sort of observing the scene. Closer narrative distance allows us to know more about the characters. We can see inside their thoughts and their feelings. We can have access to their backstories, all of those sorts of things. Along with narrative distance, third-person perspective also has the voice of the narrator themselves. You can have a fairly weak-voiced narrator that basically just speaks in sort of the character's voice, or you can have a very strongly voiced narrator who makes judgments and has opinions about the actions that they're describing. There are a whole bunch of different effects that you can create with this, everything from having unreliable narrators to having foiling dynamics between your narrator and your viewpoint character. There's a lot of flexibility here that people don't often use. Third-person perspective has a degree of flexibility and adjustability not present in the other perspectives, and this is its primary advantage. Third person allows you to more easily handle a large cast. Switching between viewpoint characters at a scene or chapter break is a common practice. Doing the same thing in first person is a lot less common. The utility of this can't be understated. Because third-person stories can have a viewpoint that happens anywhere in the universe, the reader can see every scene that they need to see and also not see anything they don't need to see for plot reasons. This makes it much easier to hide certain events or keep the reader in the dark about how certain events played out. The fact that you can switch between characters is also incredibly convenient if not all of your characters are going to, make it to the end of the story. I mentioned this earlier, but writing in third limited is also easier because you can refer to the character in different ways. You can use their name, their pronoun, or another noun to describe them. This makes sentence structures easier to vary. Even something like describing what a character looks like is easier in third person. The narrator describing themselves always feels awkward to me in first person. I can't think of a disadvantage to third person other than maybe it puts some distance between the reader and the character, but with a close narrative distance, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I think you can be as close and have as strong a character voice in a very tightly written third person as you can have in a first-person perspective. You can run into issues with having too many viewpoint characters or having poorly written viewpoints, but that's more of an issue with execution rather than the perspective itself. I would also add that I think for new writers especially, third person is a little bit harder to write in. I know for me, when I was first starting out, I found getting character thoughts and feelings and character voice a lot easier in first person perspective. Even though doing those things in third person is actually very similar, it just felt more intuitive to do it in first person. So I could maybe see an argument that first person, from the perspective of learning how to write character voice and character thoughts, is easier for a new writer to get their arms around. But ultimately, there is no best perspective, but many stories will fit into a specific perspective better than others. I'd love to hear your perspective on this video, so please leave a comment down below. And as always, thanks for watching. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. I think I thanked you for watching like 3 times there.